Hello and welcome to the story of George Frederik Handel. Handel was born in Halle, in Saxony. His father was a barber and a surgeon. He started playing the harpsichord and the organ when he was very young. He was given a clavichord when he was 7, and he used to practice it in the attic where his father could not hear him. At the age of 9, he was already composing. He had a teacher called Friedrich William Zachau, who was the organist of the big church in Halle. He learnt the organ, harpsichord and violin, as well as composition and harmony. However, Handel's father did not want him to study music, as you can see from this photo. He wanted him to be a lawyer. Although Handel's father died in 1697, Handel enrolled at the University of Halle. He studied law for a year because his father wanted him to do so. After that year, Handel was unhappy studying law. He decided to stop studying law and become a musician. He became organist at the Protestant church in Halle. Next year, he moved to Hamburg, where he got a job as a violinist and harpsichordist in the orchestra of the Opera House. He wrote his first 2 operas, Almira and Nero, when he was there. Handel was becoming a very good composer of operas, but he wanted to learn more, so he went to Italy. In 1707 he spent 4 years there, where all the famous composers were. His opera Rodrigo was produced in Florence in 1707, and his Agrippina at Venice. Agrippina was very popular and had 26 performances. It made Handel famous. He also, when he was here, met Queen Anne from England, who was about to take over the throne, and gave her some harpsichord lessons. In 1710, Handel became Kapellmeister, musical director, to George, the Elector of Hanover, who would soon be King George I of Great Britain. The Elector agreed that Handel could have an immediate leave of 12 months so he could go to London. He visited London for 8 months. He enjoyed his life in London and spent a large sum in wages. He was hugely supported by the court of Queen Anne. Thus, he did not return to Germany, but stayed in England. In 1712, Queen Anne died, and the Elector of Hanover, if you remember was his employer, who he just left, became King of Great Britain. Handel might have been in trouble for staying in Britain. According to one story, the king forgave Handel because he wrote some lovely music called the Water Music, which we will listen to. This was performed on a boat on the Thames at a royal water party. This story about the king forgiving Handel is probably not true. George would have known that Queen Anne was about to die, and he would have become King of Great Britain, and therefore Handel's master again. In fact, the new king doubled Handel's salary. A few years later, his salary increased again when he taught music to Queen Carolina's daughter. In 1724, Handel moved into a new house built in 25 Brook Street, London, which he rented until his death in 1759. The house is now called the Handel House Museum, and is open to the public and well worth a visit. It was here that the Handel composed some of his most famous music, such as Messiah, Zadok the Priest, and the Fireworks music. In 1729 he became a British national. In 1731 Handel was commissioned to write 4 anthems for the coronation ceremony of King George II. One of these, Zadok the Priest, has been sung at every coronation ceremony since. Let's listen to it. Handel spent most of his time working on operas. From 1722 to 1726, he was director of the Royal Academy of Music. This was an organisation that put on opera performances. Handel also worked in the management of the King's theatres, and many of his operas were performed in the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden. He sometimes travelled to Italy to find new Italian singers and persuade them to come to London. These singers were incredibly popular, and soon London became world famous for operas, much as it still is today. In spite of everything Handel was doing for opera, he had many enemies as well as friends. There was a lot of rivalry, especially with a composer called Bononcini, whose music is forgotten today. Handel gave up operatic management in 1740 after he lost a lot of money putting on some shows. Later years. In 1739, age 54, he had a stroke. It was probably this which left his right arm paralysed for a while, so he could not perform, but he made a recovery after 6 weeks. At this time, he started to write oratorios instead of operas, which are religious works. In 1742, his most famous oratorio, The Messiah, was first performed in Dublin. It was not successful in London, though until 1750, 11 years later, when it was performed in aid of the Foundling Hospital Chapel. The story goes that the king, who was attending the first performance, was so impressed with the Hallelujah chorus, he stood up. This is Foundling Hospital Chapel. The story goes that the king, who was attending the first performance, was so impressed with the Hallelujah chorus, he stood up. This is done today in all performances of the work. Handel performed it every year there, which brought the hospital about £600 for each performance. Handel spent much of his later years composing and producing oratorios. Judas Maccabeus was particularly popular. In 1750, on a journey back from Germany to London, Handel was seriously injured when his carriage overturned. In 1751, even worse, he started to lose his eyesight. He died in 1759 in London. His oratorios, Judas Maccabeus, was particularly popular. In 1750, on a journey back from Germany to London, Handel was seriously injured when his carriage overturned. In 1751, even worse, he started to lose his eyesight. He died in 1759 in London. His last concert was his own Messiah. More than 3,000 mourners went to his funeral. He was buried with full state honours in Westminster Abbey. Handel never married and kept his personal life very private, but he left 20,000 to the country and his niece. That's the equivalent of £28 million today. His other rest of his money was left to his friends, servants, relations and charities. His autographs, the original copies of the music he wrote, are now mostly in the British Museum. Handel lived a very long and full life. He was perhaps most famous for putting on concerts for local people, for normal people who weren't kings or queens. He was also very famous for writing oratorios in English rather than Italian or Latin, which had been up to then, so people could understand them. He's also famous because he actually served 3 kings, King George I, King George II and King George III. So that's a real sort of innings and a very long life to have met all those kings and work for them. So that's George Frederik Handel, one of the most wonderful composers of fantastically popular music.